This is episode 21 of the podcast Communicate Like This. Episode 21 is titled Integrity and Respect. In the interview with Chris Olson, he talked about his need to, quote, see the wolf, end quote. Let's talk about that today and how it can affect your ability to effectively communicate. Chris's comment came from the story of The Boy Who Cried Wolf, one of Aesop's fables. To make sure we're on the same page, that fable is about a shepherd boy who ran into his village claiming there was a wolf stalking the sheep to trick the villagers, basically because he was bored. The people in the village ran to his aid, but there was no wolf. After he pulled the trick again and fooled the villagers again, one day a wolf actually did show up. But when the shepherd boy ran to the village for help, no one believed him and the sheep were lost. The moral of the story is to tell the truth. The real issue in this fable, though, is trust. How it's earned and how it's lost, and how it impacts your ability to effectively communicate. There's a famous saying variably attributed to Abraham Lincoln or P.T. Barnum that goes, "You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time." The quote in its original form was actually said by a French person named Jacques Abadi back in the 1600s. Hey, just look at all the cool bits of trivia you get from Communicate Like This. That by itself is worth listening to this podcast. When you're fooling someone consistently, though, it's only natural that distrust begins to build in others. And that distrust, over time, then starts to naturally seep into virtually anything that you do, even if a well-intended and even if truthful. Take someone who has lied over 14,000 times over a relatively short period of, say, 3 years. You'd think that person simply wouldn't be believed at all about anything. Credibility should be totally shot, yet you remember that you can fool some of the people all of the time. So when lie number 14,001 comes out of the person's mouth, and you're on the receiving end of it, are you one of those who still believes it? Are you one who can be fooled all of the time? Most of us would like to think not. When you reach that realization point that you've been lied to, what's your reaction? Anger? Confusion? Outrage? Frustration? Self-blame? Probably none of it is positive. But what it does is start spinning your world in ways that are unproductive. Now you're spending your time worrying about whether the other person is lying or telling the truth. You've moved away from the root issue that you were discussing, or the business issue as I call it, and now the issue is lying. Now you have to solve that lying issue, or at least achieve a mutual understanding before you can get back to the original issue, the business issue. Remember, I'm just calling it a business issue for shorthand for any topic of discussion that's the point of the discussion, whether business or personal. So now both parties are engaged in the pros and cons of lying and are wasting each other's time relative to the original issue. And that's when the fight started, if you'll remember back to several episodes ago. Then your time becomes even more unproductive as you're sidetracked onto a path that neither of you intended when you first got together. The better way is to tell the truth always. Mark Twain famously said that if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Now, that's a bit of an irony given that Mark Twain's real name was Samuel Clemens, but I digress. So the more you lie, whether deliberately or unintentionally, the more trust is broken. What happens when you break trust? Well, love is largely built on trust. So no trust, no love. No trust, more arguments. No trust, more stress. No trust, more wasted time. It's almost intuitively obvious that a lack of trust has mostly bad attributes associated with it. So let's just go with that. We could explore the depths of trust and lack of trust, but to what end? Let's agree that lack of trust is bad for interpersonal relationships or just interpersonal conversations and move on from there. Moving on brings us to the topic of the day, integrity. The letter I in the core values and principles acronym that we've talked about before, ACE artist. As a refresher, in this podcast, we only use integrity to mean doing what you say you will do by when you say you will do it. In everyday use, integrity has lots of implications regarding ethics, moral principles, honesty, trustworthiness, and other such characteristics. From the website Power of Positivity, they go so far as to list 10 attributes of a person with integrity. Those are, first, taking responsibility for their actions. Second, putting others' needs above their own. Third, offering to help others in need. 4, giving others the benefit of the doubt. 5, choosing honesty in all things. 6, showing respect to everyone. 7, manifesting humility. 8, being able to admit they're wrong. 9, showing regular reliability. And 10, conveying true kindness. I found it interesting that some of these traits are actually some of the core values and principles in ACE artist, like taking responsibility for their actions, which is really accountability. The difference between those two is that accountability also means saying you'll strive to not do a particular bad action again, or saying you'll do more of a good action. Number 6 in the list gets its own place in the CVP world as respect, the R in ACE artist. We've talked about number 8 in that list that I just rattled off a few times in previous episodes, entering a discussion with the idea that you may be wrong. It's also been said that integrity is doing the right thing even though no one is watching. So, in the real world, integrity is fraught with complex meaning, but in the Perkyverse, we limit the definition of integrity to just doing what you say you will do by when you say you will do it. This is a much more concrete, measurable attribute of integrity than the other attributes, and it provides a simple way to determine if you have integrity without really any argument. You either did what you said you would do, or you didn't. Referencing episode 5, if our friend Pat said she'd be at your house at 5 o'clock, then she either showed up at 5 o'clock or she didn't. No point in arguing. It's a binary issue, meaning in math terms, it's either a 1 or a 0, the only numbers that make up the binary counting system. Another trivial fact for you. So, although that's got actual practical application in the software world, nonetheless, the point is that it's either on or off. It's either black or white. Why argue about a fact? If Pat shows up at 6 o'clock, then she was late by definition. And then for that instance, she lacked integrity. Seems kind of like a harsh judgment to impose on someone, but by definition, that's just the situation from a core values and principles standpoint. Now, maybe Pat isn't usually late. You could still judge Pat as having overall integrity, but she screwed up in this instance and lacked integrity for just this one instance. Don't paint a broad brush judgment on a small data sample of just one time. Trust and integrity are built over a longer period when you can see patterns versus a one-time event. Besides, no one's perfect, but when that pattern, in whatever judgment you have, becomes one of being late most all of the time, then that's when a correction needs to be made. Unless, of course, you don't really care about having integrity. I think one of the assumptions in this podcast is that the listeners would care about others thinking that they have integrity. So you do something about that reputation by doing what you say you will do so that you build trust, so that you can effectively communicate to reduce arguments, stress, misunderstandings, and communication, or miscommunication. You'll notice that our CVP definition of integrity involves time. doing something by when you said you would do it. That gets to deadlines. Lots of people don't like deadlines. Now, respect is another core value and principle, and that really is the other side of the coin of integrity. Because if you don't do what you say you will do, you're essentially disrespecting the other person by subtly saying, I'm more important than you. I live by my own rules. I'm above the law. You, however, you little peon, don't amount to a hill of beans. Now, imagine saying those last words out loud to someone. Just think of the negative impact that would have on your relationship. Yet, because all communication is not verbal, those could certainly be the thoughts of the person on the receiving end of you not doing what you said you would do. I'll get more into the respect component in a bit, but I wanted to point out how interrelated and codependent all of these core values and principles are. Because if integrity is tied to respect, then integrity is also tied to true prioritization. If you don't do what you said you would do by when you said you would do it, then something must have happened to get in the way of keeping your promise. Was that something an emergency that simply couldn't be avoided? If so, that's okay. Emergencies don't happen that often, so while a given incident may be out of alignment with true prioritization, that doesn't mean that your overall relatively consistent approach to life isn't aligned with true prioritization. But when you start to see a pattern of emergencies, then that's when, like Chris Olson said in the last couple of episodes, now I have to see the wolf. Your word isn't good anymore. Now I have to see the evidence myself. I've got to see the wolf. So, if it wasn't an emergency that caused you to fall out of alignment with true prioritization, what was it? Most people don't even pay attention to all the little, relatively unimportant things that happen to them during the day. But if you're not paying attention, pretty soon all those little, relatively unimportant things start to add up, and suddenly the realization dawns on you that you don't have any time left to do the thing that you promised you would do. Then you violated the CVP of integrity, but also the CVPs of respect and true prioritization. See how easy it is to fall off the wagon? But it's harder to fall off the wagon when you have that constant awareness of CVPs and their communication tools as you go about your day, like we talked about in episode 18. Let's get back to respect. Respect goes both ways. If you haven't given respect to another person, how do you think your level of respect towards them is impacted? The natural reaction by probably 99% of the people, and that's a number that I just pulled out of my nether parts versus having done any research on it, is that their respect for you goes down. Now, over time, as the pattern continues, you each respect the other less and less, leading to shabby treatment of one another, leading to ineffective communication, leading to a fallout of what friendship might have been there before, leading to more stress, arguments, misunderstandings, and miscommunication. Don't ever think you live on an island. Your actions impact others in various degrees, whether you think so or not, or whether you even think about it at all. And if you're not thinking about it at all, then you've got some narcissistic streak in you that should be addressed if you don't want to operate, or if you do want to operate smoothly and effectively in society. I don't know. Did I just fall into the trap of disrespect by calling some of you narcissists? Or did you take it that you were being called a narcissist? It's easy to do. If so, I apologize, with the caveat that, if the shoe fits, wear it. Part of this whole journey we're on with this podcast is to be able to see ourselves for what we are and how others perceive us. So being able to self-analyze with some introspection is a key. Then, if you judge that you do have a narcissistic tendency, and you don't think that it's helpful regarding effective communication, which I can absolutely guarantee you it's not, then you can take action to rewire yourself to become a better version of yourself. Let me wrap up this topic of respect with a perspective about social media. Social media, whether Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or any of those forums that allow groups to talk about issues in a group setting, but also from the safety of anonymity, has the stereotype of people ganging up on others or even ganging up individually or individually lashing out with outrageous posts, both verbally and with pictures or videos, often attacking someone personally for having the audacity to have a different opinion, often to deliberately provoke others, often to simply and deliberately create controversy to stir the pot, and often just for their own self-gratification to vent, regardless of who's in the way of their personal attacks. I've said before that in any debate, the loudest voice doesn't win. It's logic and reason that carry the day. Yet, many believe that if they're the loudest voice, or the rudest voice, or if they can type in all capital letters, then they somehow win. How does that line up with the CVP of respect? At that point, all the attacker is trying to do is figuratively beat the other person into submission. Respect is out the window, and by that point, the debate has degenerated into a real, actual argument. What if instead people could stick to logic and reason in their debates? It seems to me that when the only response to someone in a post is to lash out with a personal attack, the lasher has lost the debate. Maybe we could have a social media rule that overtly says that anyone stooping to personal attacks automatically loses the debate over whatever point they were trying to make. Even better would be for Twitter to develop an algorithm that blocks further conversation on that chain and pops up with a screen that declares the person being attacked as the winner. I've got an electric dartboard that does that when a game is won. Why not Twitter? Winner! Winner! Now, sometimes those exchanges can be entertaining, at least to a certain degree. Kind of like watching an Indy 500 crash. But often they degenerate into basic name calling at a personal level, even if it is creative. On a recent show of Real Time with Bill Maher, one of his panelists said something was like killing mosquitoes with a flamethrower. I think that just means escalating things out of proportion to the reality from an objective, neutral view. To me, it's analogous to using personal attacks in arguments or debates. Are you trying to kill mosquitoes with a flamethrower? Ask yourself that question with a little introspection. Let me give you an example of one of those entertaining personal attacks. In the old Robin Williams movie Good Morning Vietnam from 1987, the inept Captain Houck replaces the Robin Williams character on the radio show after the Robin Williams character has built a faithful following of listeners. The private, played by Forrest Whitaker, playing the character Edward Garlick, reads some listener feedback about Captain Houck's performance to the general. Captain Houck sucks the sweat off of a dead man's balls. Then Garlick turns to the general and says in a very cheery, amused voice, "I have no idea what that means, sir, but it seems very negative to me." Now, to me, that's funny. But what if I came up to Bob and seriously said, "Bob, you suck the sweat off of a dead man's balls"? Or wrote that on a social media about Bob in all seriousness. Now it's a different story, isn't it? Imagine being on Bob's side as the receiver of that type of personal attack, assuming that Bob could understand it, but I'm sure the negativity would come across. There's a large helping of disrespect in that statement. Or for an even more classic bit from an old Saturday Night Live episode on the segment called Point Counterpoint with Jane Curtin and Dan Aykroyd from 1979. Boy, I'm starting to date myself, aren't I? Jane Curtin makes some cogent points, but at the end slips into a bit of name calling. Then, as a counterpoint and disagreeing with Curtin's well-stated opinion, Aykroyd leads with the line, "Jane, you ignorant slut." Again, funny in the context, but when applied in real life, it's a different story. Aykroyd then gets really mean, at least within the context of the comedy bit, and rants on for about another minute, barely taking a breath. Look up the video of this Saturday Night Live segment on YouTube. It lasts for about 2 minutes, but watch it in the context of today's social media, which magnifies things about 1,000 times. Sorry, but real life isn't a Saturday Night Live bit. Real words can do damage in real life, despite the saying that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Follow that CVP of respect and let it guide you, and you won't end up in flame-throwing exchanges with people you don't even know, or even worse, your friends or acquaintances. Final point, to reiterate a point from earlier episodes of Communicate Like This. If you're discussing a business issue, meaning a given topic of discussion, whether on social media, in person, or elsewise, if you have to stoop to personal attacks that are off topic from the business issue, that only indicates you're losing the argument on the business issue because you feel that you can't properly defend your position anymore. So all you can do is lash out with a personal attack as a defensive action, which we've also talked about in eliminating defensiveness. Such a tactic certainly wouldn't fly on a debate stage. Stick to the business issues, and you'll find yourself in much more engaging and interesting conversations. Don't those CVPs of integrity and respect sound great, especially in contrast to what we just talked about? Like Marshawn Lynch says, it's all about that action, boss. That's it for today. Thanks for listening, and remember that you can leave comments directly on the podcast's home site of Libsyn, Libsyn, at www.communicatelikethis.com. Your feedback is so important to keep me on point and makes the podcast more current with real-life examples of how you all are using this stuff to really reduce arguments, stress, misunderstandings, and miscommunication. Keep that feedback coming. Remember that many of these concepts are found in my management book, Uncommon Sense Management. So if you want to get at it all at once in one place, pick up that book from Amazon or on Kindle. Talk to you next time.